It's unnecessary. It's the Western Hemisphere is vital for the United States of America. When America shines, the world shines, because they all need to make sure America is strong and powerful to take care of them. God forbid.
It's hard to ignore how quiet the room got, Ashley, the looks on the faces of the people on stage. Is that a preview of what the president will be facing tomorrow for his speech? And what do you make of what Lutnick said?
Well, again, I would go back to that Bannon quote you read, and there was another part of it, which I understand why you didn't read on air, but he basically said something very colorful about what the president is doing to the Overton window, which is essentially shattering it. And so I think what we are seeing here and what the president should be expected to face at Davos and what world leaders are bracing for is a president who strategically, although it's less a strategy and more of a raw, visceral gut instinct, starts with steps that most people, especially who are not following the news closely, can agree with. So when he violates a norm, or a constitutional right or international law, he often starts with some of the more unsavory characters who people don't really want to defend. Is due process a right? Absolutely. But how many people want to stand up and fight vigorously for due process for, someone Trump says is here illegally, is a gang member, is a criminal, and may have committed an abhorrent crime? And from that place, and again, this applies to the global stage, he starts there and slowly moves further and further past previous breaking points, past what people previously thought was acceptable, until we find him talking quite seriously about wanting to take control of Greenland, potentially by force.
So, Jeffrey, overnight, Trump posted what appeared to be two private messages, one from French President Macron, in which he says he doesn't understand what Trump is doing. Another from the head of NATO, Mark Rutte, saying he's committed to finding a way forward on the issue. To what extent is the history of foreign policy and the way the U.S. practices it being rewritten publicly in real time?
It's really quite astounding. There's no historical precedent that we have at all. First, for a president using personal diplomacy in the middle of the night, texting. But secondly, the United States has stood for the international stability and order since 1945. I mean, we have to remember that NATO is something that we basically created. The international system, something that we basically created. And Donald Trump personalizing this is something that, frankly, I can't imagine any previous president doing. I mean, one of the things that's really important to remember is when the people who wrote the Constitution thought about the presidency, thought about any politician really, but especially the presidency, what they really cared about was somebody who was going to think about the country's interest over their own. They actually referred to that as classical virtue. They put in the community above yourself. And Donald Trump has said repeatedly that he wants to take Greenland because he's upset he didn't get the Nobel Peace Prize, because he's upset that he is not being treated well, because it's something that he needs for his ego. That's just not something I can actually imagine any other president, even if they thought it, saying out loud.
So, Ron, the markets have looked past a lot of the stuff that Donald Trump has done recently. Not so much today. I'm looking at the front page of CNBC. Dow drops 500 points as Trump's Greenland scheme sparks U.S. Capitol fight. Fear of global trade war. Why now? Why this?
Well, I think, I'm going to take the stock market to be less important because this is really just a relatively small decline. 1% is within, the bounds of what a regular day could look like. But clearly, the markets are nervous. What's happening with gold, silver, and U.S. Treasury bond yields may be more important. Gold is skyrocketing to new all-time highs. There's a flight to safety into that. Bond yields are climbing, which means investors are backing away from U.S. Treasuries. And that capital flight that you mentioned, if global investors start to pull money from the United States, it can have a profound effect on the level of interest rates, the value of the dollar, and then ultimately where the stock market goes. And what's really important here, Chris, is that Europe collectively owns about $3 trillion of our debt. They have tools at their disposal to retaliate if the president were to put into place sanctions, not just 10%, but 25%, and then additionally on French products and so on and so forth. If they were to launch their own trade retaliation, which would include potentially the sale of U.S. Treasury bonds, we could find ourselves in the midst of a trade war that would not just hurt Europe, but would hurt the global economy and redound negatively to the U.S. as well.
At a time when the majority of Americans already think the economy is not looking so great
Correct,
anyway,
yeah.
Michael. So far, Republicans have refused, frankly, to provide any resistance on these domestic policies. They certainly have not been publicly pushing back or coming up with a plan with what he has to say about Greenland. Are they willing, do you think, to allow him to upend decades of diplomacy, to threaten global alliances in a way that really has been escalatory going into the midterms, or will this change their calculation?
No, it's clear that they're willing to allow him to do whatever he wants to do because they think they personally can benefit politically, which I think is naive. I think as polling bears this out, especially with independents, voters want a check and balance on Donald Trump at this point. Even if they like him and support him, I think generally speaking, voters say it's not good that this guy can do whatever he wants to do. Speaker Mike Johnson, Senate Majority Leader Thune have done nothing to provide a check and balance as it relates to him going into Venezuela, as it relates to him bombing other countries in the Middle East and doing everything else. It is the job of the Congress to have something to say about it. The trade war that he started, that is the authority of the Congress to address as it relates to tariffs. They've not done that. And so I think voters are going to punish House and Senate Republicans for their failure to provide a check and balance.
Chris, what's interesting here is Steve Bannon told us all of this in 2015 when he said the plan was to deconstruct the administrative state. This is exactly what the Trump administration, in its second iteration, is now doing. This has been known.
Well, that's one
for
promise
over 10
kept.
years. Yeah, it has one promise kept.
No, seriously, it may not be on the economy.
Right.
It may not be on, he's going to get rid of a bunch of problems on day one, but that is a promise kept.
Yep. And it's detrimental to the global order. They have themselves said they wanted to upend the post-World War II order as it has been in place since 1945, and that's exactly what's happening now. Now, whether or not markets revolt and Republicans revolt with sufficient strength to stop this in its tracks remains an open question.
So, Ashley, you also made the point in your article that in recurring conversations you've had with diplomats, Democrats, even certain Republicans during Trump's first term, they believed that the election was an aberration. Now, at this point in his second term, they think Biden's victory was the aberration, and Trump's reelection is a reflection of the country at this moment. If they're right, what does that tell us about this moment?
Well, again, there was this sense after his first term, once Biden won, and Biden won quite clearly promising the antithesis of Trump, right? A return to sort of America's normal role or traditional role in the world, that those 4 years with Trump were sort of a fever dream that they could black out and move forward on. And that is just not the way the world is operating anymore, because there is a sense that even though Trump is term limited and he will not be the next president, they have no idea if it will be someone like Trump's vice president. And there's just a sense, to put it in the context of today's news, that Europeans do need to do more to prepare for a world in which you have a United States that is potentially willing to, for instance, blow up NATO, where Europeans do need to be ready to defend themselves and can't rely on the United States for everything, even though Howard Lutnick was trying to make the case that a strong United States is good for them. That's not something that holds any credence. And when you have people in the Trump administration who go over, in the first term, I covered Mike Pence quite closely as well. And a lot of what I did was I traveled with him to Eastern Europe, where he sort of winked and nod and told those allies that what they were hearing from the president wasn't actually going to happen. Those reassurances are far more infrequent now. We had J.D. Vance showing up at the Munich Security Conference as sort of his first big move and telling Europeans the world as you know it is over. But even those who want to reassure them, the words feel hollow based on the past year of behavior.
So, Jeffrey, I just got an update from Jake Traylor, who is one of our reporters at the White House. He says this: we expect the president will join Caroline Leavitt, the press secretary, at the 1 p.m. press briefing today, per a White House official. This is subject to change, but that's the plan as of this moment. I think anybody who follows Donald Trump, this wouldn't necessarily surprise them, especially on the 1-year anniversary of this second term. I'm sure he is seeing some coverage that he doesn't like. He believes that this has been the most successful presidency in the history of presidencies. How close is that to the truth?
You know, I'm hard pressed to think of another instance where a president seems to be so out of touch with the reality that the rest of the world is living in. It's very hard to understand why he would need Greenland, for example. It's very hard to understand why any president would want to violate the centrality of having alliances. I mean, the one thing that Winston Churchill was very clear about, the British prime minister, was that the only thing worse than allies was having no allies. And that has really been the comparative advantage for the United States. In fact, I would even say we need to take a little step further when we talk about this idea of the United States perhaps being a country that is blipping, if you will, on the international stage. It's not, for I think most Europeans, it's not actually that Donald Trump is the aberration. It's that, go back to the post 9/11 period, George W. Bush was for them an aberration. And they frankly, our NATO allies were frankly willing to essentially give the United States a mulligan on that one when we elected Barack Obama. And we know this because Barack Obama got the Nobel Peace Prize his first year in office, essentially for not being George W. Bush. So for the Europeans, it's not just a 10-year back and forth. They're looking at 20, 25 years now of back and forth, wondering, is the United States that created this international system after 1945 going to continue to be the partner that they hope for, or is it going to be an antagonist that they fear?